Imagine you're sitting at a dressing table in 1890. The air smells faintly of rosewater and cold cream. In front of you stands a heavy mirror rimmed in silver, its glass slightly clouded by age. The table beneath it is crowded with powders in porcelain jars, tiny glass bottles filled with mysterious tonics, and brushes carved from ivory and mother of pearl. You're not here just to look nice. In the Gilded Age, beauty is a kind of performance. Your face, your hair, your skin, they are your calling card. They announce your wealth, your health, and your place in the rigid social ladder of New York's grand ballrooms. Looking effortless is anything but effortless. So tonight, we'll take our time and open each little jar, each perfume bottle, each strange contraption, slowly uncovering the beauty secrets of a world where appearances could lift you into society's highest circles, or leave you quietly excluded. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. So let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. That's the story I'm telling tonight. Imagine walking into the parlor of a wealthy New York townhouse in the year 18. The parlor itself is a performance. Velvet curtains pulled just so, gilded picture frames with oil portraits staring down at you, and carpets so thick you almost sink into them when you step inside. But you are not here for the parlor. You are ushered upstairs, past the polished banisters, to a smaller room set aside for what society liked to call ladies' preparation. And there, standing proudly in the center, is the object of our story tonight, the dressing table. Now, when you picture a dressing table today, you might think of something sleek from IKEA, or maybe a little mirrored vanity with drawers stuffed full of lip balms and forgotten hair ties. In the Gilded Age, though, this was no ordinary piece of furniture. It was a shrine, a temple to appearances, a place where time, money, and patience were sacrificed in exchange for that most fragile of commodities, beauty. The mirror was not just glass, it was a portal into the persona you hoped to present to the world. And heaven help you if the mirror showed you something less than society expected. The table itself would likely be made of heavy, dark wood, mahogany or rosewood if your husband's investments were paying off that season, something plainer if he'd made a few too many bad bets on the stock exchange. But whatever the material, the surface would be crowded with little luxuries. Silver-backed hairbrushes gleamed beside mother-of-pearl handled combs. Tiny jars of cream sat neatly in a row, each promising to preserve youth, erase freckles, or add a dewy glow to cheeks that had not been dewy in years. And then there were the bottles, slender, elegant glass vials imported from Paris, their labels hand-lettered in French, which of course made them sound infinitely more scientific. It's worth remembering that in the Gilded Age, beauty wasn't a frivolous side project. It was practically a survival strategy for women in upper society. You weren't judged simply on how charming you were at a dinner party, though that certainly mattered. You were judged on your complexion, your hair, your figure, and how well you seemed to embody the ideal of refinement. Your looks were, in a way, your resume. You didn't submit applications to enter high society. You entered the ballroom and your face did the talking. And if it failed to impress, well, you might find your invitation suddenly went missing. The obsession with beauty went beyond vanity. It was about status. Pale, smooth skin told the world that you didn't spend your days working outdoors. A cinched waist told the world that you could afford not only expensive gowns, but also a maid who laced you into them each morning. Glossy hair and delicately gloved hands whispered that you lived in a world far away from factory soot and dishwater. Every element of the body was carefully curated, polished, and let's be honest, manipulated to tell the story of wealth and ease. And this wasn't limited to the grand houses of New York or Newport. The Gilded Age stretched its glittering influence into cities across the United States, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia. Wherever there was money to be spent, there was an eager crowd ready to imitate the fashions of the elite. Magazines and department stores spread the gospel of beauty. printing advice columns and advertisements that promised any woman with the right cream, powder, or tonic could achieve the same glow as the ladies in Fifth Avenue mansions. Of course, many of those tonics contained ingredients better suited to an apothecary than a dressing table, but in the Gilded Age, there was a remarkable tolerance for risk in the name of radiance. Let's pause here and compare this to modern time. Today, you might scroll through your phone and see an ad for a serum that claims to restore youthful elasticity. You might wonder what on earth elasticity has to do with your cheeks, and whether this tiny glass bottle really deserves to cost $65. Back then, the logic was the same, but the marketing was less subtle. A powder might promise, in bold lettering, to literally transform you into a vision of angelic purity, though the fine print failed to mention that it contained lead. A tonic might promise to invigorate your complexion and restore feminine vitality, though what it mostly contained was alcohol, which at least gave you a pleasant flush. And electricity, yes, some women were convinced that running a mild current across the face would keep wrinkles at bay. Imagine explaining that at a dinner party. Oh, this glow, it's because I electrocuted myself before dessert. But behind all this fuss and ritual, there was a quieter truth. Women in the Gilded Age were trapped between two expectations. On one hand, they were told to look perfectly natural, a gentle, innocent flush to the cheeks, clear skin, bright eyes. On the other, they were handed arsenic wafers and rouge pots, and told that true beauty never came without effort. The trick was to spend hours at the dressing table while somehow pretending you had spent none at all. Looking natural required the most unnatural process imaginable. It's easy to laugh at the extravagance of it all, but we haven't really changed that much. Consider the sheer number of beauty products lining modern shelves. Moisturizers for day, for night, for eyes, for necks, for hands, creams with vitamin C, serums with hyaluronic acid, oils promising radiance, each one claiming it's the one thing standing between you and your best self. The Gilded Age wasn't any different, only the packaging has changed. Then it was French labels and ivory brushes. Now it's sleek branding and celebrity endorsements. And in both cases, the unspoken message is the same. Your natural self, the one you woke up with, simply isn't quite enough. So when we talk about the Gilded Age mirror, we're really talking about the stage where this performance began. Women would sit, often for hours, while maids fetched hot water, mixed pastes, and brushed out. They dabbed on cold cream, powdered their faces until they glowed like porcelain, and carefully painted lips and cheeks with just enough color to appear alive, but not enough to appear scandalous. The mirror didn't just reflect them, it constructed them. It created the version of themselves that would step out into society, and it quietly demanded constant upkeep. And that's where we'll begin. With the mirror, with the table crowded with jars and powders, with the endless bottles of potions and promises. Because every beauty secret of the Gilded Age, whether it involved powders, perfume, corsets, or tonics, started right here, with a woman staring into her reflection and deciding how much she was willing to risk to be beautiful. If there was one feature that mattered above all else in the Gilded Age beauty ideal, it was the skin. A flawless complexion wasn't simply considered attractive, it was practically a social requirement. Pale skin meant you were untouched by the sun, which meant you had no need to toil outdoors. Smooth skin meant youth, health, and refinement. And the women of Fifth Avenue were willing to go to great lengths, both charming and alarming, to achieve it. The simplest and most common weapon in this battle for perfection was powder. Ladies of the Gilded Age adored their powders: rice powder, chalk powder, and, less fortunately, powders containing lead or zinc oxide. These were dusted onto the face until the skin took on that desired porcelain glow. Imagine leaving the house each morning with a faint but undeniable look of freshly sifted flour across your cheeks. In an era without Instagram filters, the powder puff was the closest thing to retouch. Cold cream was another staple. Pond's cold cream launched in the late 1800s, became something of a household name. It was advertised as the cure for everything from dryness to freckles. The ritual was soothing. A dab of cream, rubbed gently into the face, promising to preserve the bloom of youth. Did it work? Well, it kept the skin from drying out in winter, which was something. It also left the faint smell of menthol and camphor lingering around the house, which at least made it obvious you'd done your routine. And then there were the more adventurous methods. Some women took arsenic wafers, tiny pills that promised to whiten the skin from within. Think of them as the 19th century equivalent of a dangerous beauty supplement marketed on TikTok. The logic was simple. Paleness equals purity. And what could be more pure than slowly poisoning yourself with arsenic? Other remedies included ammonia washes, vinegar tonics, and, for the especially daring, injections of paraffin wax under the skin to smooth out wrinkles. Yes, essentially an early version of fillers, but with a slightly higher chance of disfigurement. Freckles, in particular, were despised. Entire newspaper columns were dedicated to the removal of freckles, offering recipes that mixed lemon juice with sour milk, borax, or even mercury. The instructions were always the same: apply diligently and wait, and wait, and wait. Eventually the freckles might fade, or your skin might peel off in layers. Either way, society applauded your effort. What makes this especially fascinating is how much of it sounds familiar. We may not be using arsenic wafers anymore, but the dream of a glowing, poreless complexion hasn't gone anywhere. Today it's sheet masks, serums with ingredients most of us can't pronounce, and lasers that promise to rejuvenate skin overnight. In both cases, women were told the same thing. Your natural face isn't enough, but if you just invest in this next miracle product, you might finally achieve perfection. The more things change, the more they stay the same. If pale skin whispered refinement, a gentle blush shouted vitality. The trick, of course, was to look as though you hadn't applied anything at all. Rouge, or blush, occupied a strange and often controversial place in the Gilded Age beauty ritual. Too much, and you risked looking like an actress, or worse, a woman of questionable respectability. Too little, and you risked appearing sickly under the harsh glow of gaslight. Rouge was typically made from carmine, a pigment derived from crushed cochineal insects. A little pot of rouge could be smuggled discreetly in a reticule, dabbed on the cheeks before a ball. Other recipes suggested strawberries, raspberries, or beets, essentially turning your kitchen into a cosmetics counter. A clever maid might even mix vinegar with red wine to create a quick tint. And lips, though technically not to be painted, often received the faintest dab of the same solution. Just enough to look naturally flushed, but never enough to look painted. The social rules around rouge were labyrinthine. Aristocratic women claimed they wore none at all, though their glowing cheeks mysteriously suggested otherwise. Middle-class women dabbled in homemade recipes, but were warned by etiquette manuals never to paint excessively. Actresses, on the other hand, wore it openly, their faces practically glowing with stage paint. And in that difference lay the real point. Rouge wasn't just makeup, it was a marker of class. Imagine the irony of sitting at your dressing table, applying layer after layer of powder to erase freckle, only to immediately smear a bit of rouge back on, to simulate the health you just powdered away. The whole ritual was like baking a cake, and then carefully scraping the frosting back off, just to prove you could. Rouge scandals even made the newspaper. Stories circulated of women fainting because their rouge contained lead or mercury. Doctors warned of painted women suffering mysterious ailments. Yet still, the pots of rouge sold steadily, tucked discreetly in the shelves of drugstores and imported boutiques, because no matter what society pretended to disapprove of, no woman wanted to appear ghostly pale under the chandeliers of the ballroom. And here again, we see ourselves. Today, makeup aisles overflow with blush palettes in every shade, from sun-kissed peach to forbidden berry. Tutorials carefully explain how to apply blush where the sun would naturally hit your face. as though anyone believes you just woke up glowing. We chase the same illusion, only with more glitter and fewer insects. And like the women of the Gilded Age, we pretend the process is effortless, even though the effort is everything. If skin was the canvas and rouge was the flourish, hair was the crown, and women of the Gilded Age treated it accordingly. Hair was a statement piece, a measure of femininity, and, unfortunately, a relentless burden. Long, glossy hair was the ideal, but achieving it required patience, labor, and occasionally sleight of hand. A typical hairstyle might involve braids, twists, curls, and buns arranged into an elaborate tower perched precariously on the head. Add in hairpieces, wigs, and rats, pads of stuffed hair used to create volume, and you can imagine why women spent hours in front of the mirror each day. Some even saved their own shed hair in little jars, later repurposed to bulk up the next style. Recycling, but make it fashionable. Hair products were a booming industry. Pomades made with bear grease or petroleum jelly promised shine. Vinegar rinses claimed to keep locks glossy. Egg yolk masks were touted as treatments long before Instagram DIY videos made them trendy again. And then there were the hair tonic, bottles promising to cure baldness, stop shedding, or guarantee luxurious growth. Many of them smelled suspiciously of alcohol and herbs, more like salad dressing than science. The pressure was enormous. Hair wasn't just decoration, it was moral currency. Thick, long hair suggested health and vitality. Short or thinning hair carried a faint suggestion of illness, or worse, moral failing. Women traded recipes for growth tonics as though they were secret family heirlooms. And just like today, magazines loved to print advertisements showing before and after illustrations. One sad, balding woman in the before, followed by the same woman looking radiant with flowing tresses in the after. The difference? Likely an expensive wig. Of course, wigs themselves were a thriving market. Imported European hairpieces were prized, but local hair dealers did steady business as well. Women were encouraged to sell their locks for cash, meaning that someone else's flowing tresses might end up adorning a wealthy lady's head. A strange kind of intimacy when you think about it. Your hair living a better life than you ever could. And like skin and rouge, hair carried contradictions. Women were told to appear effortlessly radiant, yet behind that supposed effortlessness was an entire industry of brushes, combs, oils, and false additions. It's not unlike the modern expectation that hair should always be natural, meaning naturally silky, glossy, and perfectly behaved, which of course requires heat tools, sprays, conditioners, and the occasional salon miracle treatment. So, the hair obsession of the Gilded Age was not a trivial matter. It was the final flourish of a carefully constructed appearance. The curls, the shine, the volume. They weren't just about beauty. They were about belonging, about signaling status, about showing that you could afford the endless hours and products required to maintain such splendor. In the end, hair was the one crown every woman was expected to wear, even if it had to be borrowed, bought, or built from yesterday's combing. If there is one object that defines the Gilded Age silhouette, the very image that comes to mind when you picture a woman sweeping into a ballroom beneath glittering chandeliers, it is the corset. Stiff, laced, and unrelenting, the corset was the quiet architect of every fashionable figure. Without it, the gowns of Worth or the House of Doucet would have sagged sadly on their wearers. With it, the body was cinched into the ideal, a tiny waist, generous hips, and a full bust, forming the famous hourglass shape that every society matron and debutante was expected to present to the world. Now, let's be honest, the corset has earned a reputation. We've all heard horror stories, organs crushed, ribs displaced, fainting couches placed strategically in every parlor to catch collapsing women. And yes, there is truth to these tales. Tight lacing, the practice of pulling corsets to extremes, sometimes down to waists of 16 or even 14 inches, did have very real consequences. Doctors of the time wrote long, hand-wringing essays about the dangers, shortness of breath, indigestion, even deformities of the rib cage. And yet, the corset remained. Because in the Gilded Age, beauty was never supposed to be comfortable. The ritual of corset dressing was, in itself, a kind of daily performance. Few women could lace themselves tightly without help, so maids were enlisted to pull the strings, tugging until the lady gave either a nod of approval or a faint gasp for mercy. Picture it, a woman gripping the bedpost, drawing in her breath, while behind her, a maid yanked mercilessly at the laces, the corset creaking like a ship's rigging in high wind. Modern shapewear has nothing on this. Your Spanx may feel snug, but at least it doesn't require another human being to install. Corsets were not only about reducing the waist, they were about control. They dictated posture, ensuring a woman stood upright, shoulders back, chest lifted. Slouching was impossible. Sitting required precision. Even breathing was disciplined into shallow, delicate sighs, which conveniently and society interpreted as feminine and refined. A woman who gasped softly when standing from her chair was not ill, she was fashionable. And yet, for all the criticism corsets receive today, it's worth noting that many women of the time defended them. They argued that corsets supported the back, relieved strain during long hours of standing at social events, and helped distribute the weight of heavy skirts. Some even described their corset as a second skin, claiming to feel exposed without its reassuring grip. This might sound absurd to us, but consider the way some people today swear they can't leave the house without their shapewear, or the way gym devotees insist on waist trainers. The tools have changed, but the logic remains strangely familiar. Corsetry also intersected with class. A perfectly cinched waist indicated leisure. You had the time, the money, and the staff to maintain such an impractical silhouette. Working women wore corsets too, but theirs were sturdier, designed for function as much as form. The divide was clear. A delicate 18-inch waist belonged to the drawing room, not the factory. And so, the corset became more than clothing. It was an identity. It said, I belong in this world of elegance, of wealth, of marble staircases and glittering chandeliers. It also said, silently, I endure pain in exchange for approval. Which is, when you think about it, not so different from high heels today. They lengthen the leg, refine the gait, and silently punish the wearer. Yet still, women wear them because the world quietly expects them to. So when we talk about the Gilded Age and its beauty secrets, the corset is not a mere accessory. It was the unseen foundation of the entire look, the iron framework upon which the illusion of effortless beauty was constructed. Without it, the gowns would collapse, the figure would blur, and society would whisper. With it, women could glide into the ballroom as though sculpted from marble, breathtakingly elegant, and perhaps just a little short of breath. While the corset shaped the grand silhouette, beauty in the Gilded Age was also about the tiniest detail. A woman might spend hours perfecting her skin, her hair, her gown, but if her hands were rough or her feet too large, society would notice. And notice they did. The body in this age was judged from head to toe, and no part escaped scrutiny. Hands in particular carried enormous symbolism. A pair of pale, delicate hands spoke volumes. They revealed that you did not scrub laundry, peel potatoes, or toil in a field. They were proof of leisure, of refinement. Entire industries flourished on this single obsession. Gloves were the most obvious accessory: silk, kid leather, or lace, depending on the occasion. A proper lady might own dozens of pairs, each carefully matched to gowns and occasions. Gloves didn't just protect the skin from the sun, they protected reputation itself. But beneath the gloves, the hands had to be prepared. Lemon juice was a favorite remedy, used to whiten and soften the skin. Vinegar soaks promised to bleach away any hint of labor. Cold cream was massaged nightly into fingers, ensuring they stayed supple. And though manicures as we know them were not yet mainstream, women did gently buff and polish their nails, often using little ivory tools from their dressing table. Painted nails would have been scandalous, but well-tended natural nails were an absolute must. Feet, meanwhile, carried their own burden. Tiny, dainty feet were idealized, not because anyone actually cared about the anatomy of a foot, but because they implied dainty steps, dainty movement, dainty everything. Shoes were often narrow, pinching toes into submission. A large foot was whispered about, as though it were a moral failing. And yet, women still had to walk, down Fifth Avenue, across ballrooms, up staircases. The result, a quiet epidemic of corns, bunions, and aching arches hidden beneath layers of satin slippers. One could argue that podiatry as a profession owes much of its existence to 19th century fashion. These details mattered because they completed the illusion. A woman might wear a Worth gown shimmering with sequins, but if her hands bore the faint redness of scrubbing, or her feet shuffled heavily, rather than gliding gracefully, the illusion shattered. Beauty, in the Gilded Age, was holistic. Every detail mattered, down to the way you extended your hand to accept a dance card, or the lightness of your step as you crossed a ballroom floor. It's hard not to compare this with the modern obsession over detail. Today, we fuss over manicures, pedicures, cuticles, and nail art. We polish and buff, paint and gel, all to present fingertips that suggest careful attention. Our shoes may be more forgiving, but the pressure remains. To glide, to move gracefully, to appear effortlessly put together from head to toe. The technology's changed. Lemon juice has been replaced by cuticle, narrow slippers by stilettos, but the pressure remains hauntingly the same. And so, the hands and feet of the Gilded Age woman were not just extremities, they were extensions of her identity. Her handshake was soft, her steps were light, her nails were smooth, and her shoes whispered refinement with every click across a marble floor. Beauty lived in the details, and women of the era knew it. They preserved those details with creams, gloves, soaks, and sacrifices that may sound absurd today, until we remember the hours we spend moisturizing, filing, painting, and posing our own hands for the perfect photo. If beauty in the Gilded Age had a final invisible flourish, it was perfume. Scent, after all, was the most immediate introduction you could give someone. Before a word was spoken or a curtsy made, a woman announced herself with fragrance. And in an age of opulence, perfume was not just about smelling pleasant, it was about smelling expensive. Perfume had always been linked to wealth, but in the Gilded Age, it became almost theatrical. The finest fragrances were imported from Paris, arriving in dainty glass bottles with stoppers cut like jewels. Guerlain, Houbigant, and other legendary French houses sent their wares across the Atlantic to the women of Fifth Avenue. But you didn't just wear a perfume, you displayed it. The bottles themselves were part of the vanity tableau, crystal flacons with delicate stoppers, sometimes etched with gilt, sometimes capped with silver filigree. Just owning them was a performance of taste. The popular scents of the time leaned toward floral, rose, violet, lilac, soft, ladylike fragrances that suggested innocence and refinement. Musk and amber were used too, but cautiously, for anything too heady or animalic could tip over into scandal. One did not wish to smell like passion itself, at least not in the drawing room. The ideal was to smell faintly of a summer garden that had never known dirt. The rules were clear. A proper lady's perfume was always subtle, too strong, and you were accused of vulgarity. Too faint, and you were invisible. The sweet spot was a gentle aura, a scent that lingered just enough to be noticed when you passed, like the whisper of a secret. Ladies' magazines of the time carried anxious advice columns: how many drops to apply, how long before an event, whether one should dab wrists, neck, or handkerchief. One columnist advised that the well-bred lady's perfume should only be detected in close conversation. a line that has probably been repeated in beauty magazines for the last 100 years, with only the font changing. Of course, not everyone could afford imported Parisian perfumes. Enter the American perfume industry, which was booming by the 1880s. Companies offered cheaper versions, bottled in simpler glass, often with labels depicting roses or cherubs to give the impression of luxury. These scents were more accessible to shopgirls and clerks who wanted to emulate their social betters. These fragrances were within reach of shopgirls and clerks, enabling them to mimic the styles of their social superiors. And so, perfume became one of the first beauty luxuries to cross class lines. Anyone could smell refined, even if their dress came from a department store bargain rack. Perfume also intersected with courtship. A scented handkerchief slipped to a suitor, or the faint trace of lilac left on a glove, could stir endless speculation. Scent lingered long after the woman herself had left the room, haunting parlors and ballrooms, sparking daydreams. It was both intimate and elusive. Writers of the time loved to describe heroines not by their appearance, but by their fragrance, a narrative trick that said as much about the fantasy of beauty as any powdered cheek. And here, again, the Gilded Age feels strangely familiar. Today, perfume marketing is still about identity, aspiration, and seduction. The bottles are just as theatrical, the names just as extravagant: Eternal Bloom, Narcotic Rose, Alien Goddess. And the rules still hover. Too much is gauche, too little is forgettable. We're told even now to find our signature scent, as though fragrance were less about chemistry and more about soul. So when a woman of the Gilded Age dabbed lilac water on her gloves before heading out to an opera, she wasn't simply accessorizing, she was crafting an aura, one as carefully curated as her corset and coiffure. And if the gentleman leaned a little closer to catch the fragrance, well, wasn't that the point? Of course, not all Gilded Age beauty secrets were glamorous. Some of them were downright bizarre. Others were dangerous. Many were both, because beneath the layers of powder and perfume, women were constantly chasing the dream of eternal youth. And the marketplace was more than happy to exploit that desperation. Take, for instance, arsenic wafers. Sold in tidy little boxes, they promised to whiten the complexion from within. Arsenic, the same substance used in rat poison, was marketed as the secret to luminous skin. Ladies swallowed these wafers with the same confidence that we might swallow a multivitamin today. Advertisements assured them that the doses were small, carefully controlled, entirely safe, which of course they weren't. Doctors occasionally reported cases of nausea, weakness, and even death linked to these so-called beauty tablets. But sales continued because nothing sells quite like the promise of effortless perfection. Or consider belladonna eye drop. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, dilates the pupil. A wide-eyed, doe-like gaze was considered irresistibly beautiful. A few drops of belladonna, and the eyes shimmered with unnatural brightness. Never mind that prolonged use could cause blurred vision, headaches, and in some cases, blindness. Beauty required sacrifice, and if that sacrifice was the ability to read, well, you could always have your maid read the letters aloud. Then there were the gadgets. The Gilded Age loved contraptions. Electrical facial stimulators were sold as miracle, promising to tone the skin with mild shock. Women were encouraged to strap them on at night, as though a little electrocution would smooth out the day's wrinkle. Others tried rubber face masks, literal masks meant to be worn in bed, trapping heat and sweat against the skin to purify the complexion. Imagine trying to fall asleep while your face slowly cooked under a sheet of rubber. Restful indeed. Snake oil tonics abounded too. Hair tonics containing mysterious herbs promised to cure baldness. Lotions mixed with turpentine and ammonia claimed to banish wrinkles. There were even complexion waters laced with alcohol and mercury, guaranteeing radiance at the cost of your liver. Every corner druggist seemed to have some secret formula, often bottled in ornate glass, labeled with cursive fonts. and sold with a wink of pseudoscience. And perhaps the most peculiar of all, the tapeworm diet. Yes, certain advertisements, though likely exaggerated, hinted at pills containing tapeworm eggs, designed to help women remain slim while still indulging in the multi-course dinners of the Gilded Age. The idea was simple: let a parasite do the dieting for you. Of course, parasites came with side effects, like malnutrition and, occasionally, death. But what was that compared to the horror of an expanding waistline? When we look back on these odd remedies, it's easy to scoff. How could anyone have believed in arsenic wafers or belladonna drops? But then, we might glance at our own cabinets today. Creams containing snail slime, facials involving bee venom, jade rollers, LED masks, radio frequency machine, vampire facials. Every age has its eccentricity, and ours is no less peculiar. The packaging may be sleeker, the science more polished, but the impulse is the same: to believe that somewhere, in some jar or device, lies the secret to beauty that will defy time itself. And so, the odd and dangerous remedies of the Gilded Age weren't simply curiosity. They were proof of a deeper truth, that beauty, when tied to status and survival, will always push people toward extremes. Whether swallowing arsenic wafers, strapping on electric shocks, or enduring today's chemical peels, the goal is unchanged: to chase an ideal that forever hovers just out of reach, demanding one more product, one more ritual, one more sacrifice. Until now, we've lingered mostly in the boudoir of New York's wealthiest women, the ones with mirrored vanities, ivory-handled brushes, and imported perfumes from Paris. But beauty in the Gilded Age wasn't limited to the upper crust. Shop girls, clerks, actresses, and seamstresses also participated in the rituals of appearance, though on a very different scale. Their beauty secrets were not written in gilt-edged journals or whispered in the corners of Fifth Avenue ballrooms, but rather pieced together from drugstore department store bargains, and the occasional bit of kitchen ingenuity. For working women, the challenge was twofold. On the one hand, they were still expected to look neat, appealing, and presentable, especially if their job placed them in the public eye. A department store clerk, for example, was part of the store's image. She couldn't very well stand behind a counter selling silk gloves if her own hands looked calloused. An actress had to maintain a stage presence that convinced the audience of glamour, even if her dressing room backstage was barely larger than a broom closet. On the other hand, too much effort, too much visible makeup, too much paint on the cheeks invited suspicion. Respectability hovered in a precarious balance, and working women were forced to walk that tightrope every day. The products they used were often humbler cousins of those found on wealthy vanities. Instead of imported creams, they might purchase cold cream from a local apothecary, the kind sold in plain glass jars with utilitarian label. Powder might come in a tin rather than a porcelain pot, dusted onto the face in hurried moments before rushing to work. Perfumes were cheaper blends, often heavy with alcohol, their floral notes fading quickly. Still, the effect mattered more than the ingredients. A faint powdery glow, a dab of rose water, a smoothed lock of hair. These small touches could make all the difference between appearing refined and appearing careless. Homemade remedies were popular too, passed along in women's magazines or shared between friends. Lemon juice lightened freckles. Rosewater could be mixed at home, distilled from petals in a saucepan. Cornstarch doubled as powder, especially for women who couldn't afford anything else. Vinegar rinses kept hair shiny, though they also left behind a faint odor that probably reminded people of salad. These were not luxuries, they were improvisations, strategies to achieve the appearance of care with minimal expense. Actresses especially occupied a complicated space in the world of beauty. They were both trendsetters and cautionary tales. On stage, rouge was necessary to keep features visible under harsh gaslights. Lip stains and powder were practically tools of the trade. But offstage, those same painted faces were condemned by society as evidence of moral looseness. A woman working in theatre could not win. If she wore makeup, she was criticized for immodesty. If she didn't, she looked ghastly beneath the stage light. Still, actresses helped spread trends, whether society admitted it or not. Their daring use of rouge and hairpieces filtered slowly into middle-class routines, eventually blurring the line between performance and daily life. Department store workers also contributed to this shift. The rise of massive retail palaces like Macy's and Wanamaker's meant that cosmetics could be displayed and sold more openly than ever before. For the first time, a young woman might walk through a perfume counter, try a dab of violet water, and carry home a small bottle for herself. It was a democratization of beauty, even if the more expensive items remained out of reach. Just being able to buy a little powder in a tin was a small act of self-presentation, a way of claiming dignity in a world that often denied it. Of course, the standards were uneven. A wealthy woman painting her cheeks was chic, but a shop girl with visible rouge risked being called indecent. Respectability hinged on class. Working women were expected to appear attractive, but never too attractive. Clean, but not showy. Well-groomed, but not painted. The line was thin, and many walked it nervously. Manuals of etiquette warned young women not to fall into the trap of artifice. Employers sometimes explicitly forbade painted faces among staff. And yet, the products sold steadily, which tells you everything you need to know about how much pressure these women face to conform. This double standard rings familiar, doesn't it? Even today, women in certain workplaces are expected to look polished, to wear makeup that appears natural, hair that is professional, nails that are subtle. But woe to the woman who appears overdone. What exactly counts as overdone, of course, depends entirely on who is doing the judging. In the Gilded Age, it was society matrons and employers. Today, it's HR guidelines, Instagram comments, or the endless advice columns that still somehow find ways to remind women that the balance between effort and excess is entirely their responsibility. But perhaps the most striking thing about beauty for working women in the Gilded Age was the quiet dignity with which they pursued it. There is something moving about a seamstress smoothing a bit of cornstarch across her cheeks before heading to the theatre, or a clerk saving pennies for a tiny bottle of rosewater. These gestures weren't about vanity, they were about self-respect, about carving out a sense of presence in a world that rarely granted it. Beauty for them was not just ornament, it was armor, and in this way, the story of beauty in the Gilded Age widens. It wasn't only the elaborate boudoir of Fifth Avenue that defined the era's ideals, it was also the crowded dressing rooms backstage, the cramped boarding houses with makeshift vanities, the lunch breaks where shop girls compared powders. Beauty trickled down through class lines, adapted and reshaped, carrying with it the same burdens and the same aspirations, to be seen, to belong, to present a face to the world that said, "I matter too." By the late 1800s, something remarkable was happening in America. Beauty, once a collection of private rituals practiced quietly at dressing tables or whispered about in hushed tones, was beginning to step boldly into the public eye. What had once been taboo, the admission that women did things to enhance their looks, was slowly transforming into an industry. The Gilded Age didn't just create fortunes and railroads and grand mansions, it created the beginnings of what we now call beauty culture. Part of this shift came from advertising. Newspapers and ladies' magazines discovered that beauty products sold papers. The back pages filled with small ads promising creams that erased wrinkles, powders that smoothed complexions, tonics that restored feminine vitality. The language was intoxicating, half science and half poetry. One ad promised that freckles would fade like dew beneath the morning sun. Another assured women that a particular hair tonic would bring the gloss of a raven's wing to their tired locks. Whether or not the products delivered was almost beside the point. The idea that beauty could be bought, not just inherited, was a revelation. And the true geniuses of this revelation were the women who built empires out of jars and powders. Helena Rubinstein and Elizabeth Arden were still at the dawn of their careers by the end of the Gilded Age, but their influence was already germinating. These entrepreneurs understood something radical, that women didn't just want products, they wanted experiences, they wanted salons, places where beauty was not a secret, but a service, where rituals could be performed with professional hands and an air of legitimacy. It was no small thing. For centuries, women had been accused of deceit for painting their faces. In the Gilded Age, the narrative began to shift. Beauty was no longer shameful if it was framed as health, hygiene, or science. A cream wasn't vanity. It was complexion preservation. A tonic wasn't paint. It was circulatory stimulation. By reframing appearance as wellness, beauty culture stepped neatly out of the shadows and onto Fifth Avenue. Department stores played a huge role in this transformation. The very same palaces of consumption that sold gowns and jewels also created entire counters devoted to beauty. Clerks in neat uniforms sold powders and perfumes directly to women, no longer hiding these purchases behind the discretion of apothecaries. You could now walk into a store, test a fragrance, compare creams, and leave with a little bag that promised sophistication. Shopping for beauty became an outing in itself, woven into the rituals of consumer life. Magazines amplified the message. Advice columns popped up, written in tones both sympathetic and stern. One column might explain how to mix a homemade facial mask with oatmeal and honey, while another would scold against the vulgarity of too much rouge. Illustrations showed the correct way to powder, the correct posture for grooming, the correct styles of hair for different face shapes. For the first time, women across America, from New York to Kansas, could read the same advice, buy the same products, and aspire to the same ideals. The standard of beauty was no longer purely local, it was national, and it is here, in this moment, that the modern beauty industry was truly born. Because what advertising and department stores did was not just sell creams and powders, they sold identity. They sold the idea that every woman, with the right purchases, could transform herself into the image society demanded. Beauty was democratized, but it was also commodified. You didn't just need a natural glow, you needed the product that gave you the glow. And if that product was out of reach, well, you needed to dream about it until the next paycheck. Of course, not everyone embraced this culture immediately. Traditionalists sniffed that beauty should remain natural. Doctors fretted about dangerous ingredients. Moralists warned that painted faces signaled a decline in value. But the tide was turning. Once beauty had been rebranded as health, once it was sold alongside respectable goods in reputable stores, there was no stopping it. By the early 1900s, salons and beauty parlors dotted city streets, advertising facials, massages, and treatments once reserved for the boudoir. And perhaps the most telling shift of all, beauty began to be seen not just as a luxury, but as a duty. Articles scolded women for neglecting their appearance, as though an unpowdered face were not simply natural, but careless. To appear in public without effort became a kind of social offense, which, if you think about it, sounds remarkably modern. Even today, women are told to make an effort, to take care of themselves, as though beauty were less a personal choice and more a civic responsibility. So when we trace the rise of beauty culture in the Gilded Age, we are really tracing the beginning of something we all live with today. The idea that beauty is a routine, a practice, a purchase, that it is never finished, never secure, but always in need of one more cream, one more treatment, one more product on the shelf. The women of the Gilded Age may have powdered their faces with rice and dabbed violet water behind their ears, but the cycle they lived in, of desire, purchase, and pursuit, feels eerily familiar every time we pass a Sephora window. In this way, the Gilded Age did more than produce elaborate gowns and glittering mansions. It produced us. Our beauty aisles, our advertisements, our endless debates about natural versus enhanced, all echo back to those mirrored dressing tables on Fifth Avenue, when women first began to realize that beauty could be bought, marketed, and standardized. The culture was born there, and it has never really gone away. When we stand back from the powders, the perfumes, the corsets, and the creams, what lingers most about the Gilded Age beauty rituals is how familiar they feel. Yes, the ingredients were different. Arsenic wafers and belladonna drops have thankfully fallen out of fashion, but the cycle of hope, promise, and performance has never gone away. Women then, as now, were told that beauty was both their ticket into society and the proof of their worth once they were there. The mirror on a Gilded Age vanity reflected more than a face. It reflected expectations, pale skin that declared you had never worked outdoors, a tiny waist that declared you could afford the luxury of discomfort, glossy hair that declared you belonged in a parlor, not a factory. Every feature carried meaning, every detail a silent announcement of status, and while the specifics may have shifted, the logic has not. Today, we might talk about wellness or self-care, but beneath the softer language lies the same truth. Women are still expected to curate themselves, to invest time, money, and energy into appearing effortlessly polished. But there is also something else in that mirror, something quieter. When we read about the department store clerk saving for a little jar of cold cream, or the actress painting her cheeks before stepping into the gaslight, we see not vanity, but resilience. These were women finding ways to present themselves with dignity in a world that offered them little else. Beauty was never just surface, it was survival. It was a claim to visibility, to being noticed, to asserting presence in rooms where they might otherwise have been overlooked. And so, the legacy of Gilded Age beauty is both glittering and complicated. It gave us the beginnings of the modern beauty industry, with all its seductions and its burdens. It gave us the myth of natural beauty that is anything but natural. It gave us products, rituals, and expectations that still shape how women are seen today. But it also gave us stories of women who, even under the pressure of impossible ideals, found small rituals of care, small ways to assert themselves in a society that measured them by appearances. In the end, the jars of powder have crumbled, the corsets have loosened, the perfumes have evaporated into air. What remains is the mirror. The same mirror we stand before today, wondering what it demands of us, and what, in turn, we are willing to give. And that is the story I wanted to tell you tonight. From the mirrored vanities of Fifth Avenue to the humble tins of powder tucked in a shopgirl's drawer, the Gilded Age was an era where beauty was both a promise and a price, where women chased radiance with powders, perfumes, and corsets, sometimes dangerously, sometimes joyfully, always with the weight of expectation pressing down. If you're still awake, perhaps you're thinking about the jars on your own dresser, or the quiet rituals you go through each morning. If you've drifted off, then maybe the last thing you'll remember is the faint scent of rose water in a long-vanished parlor, and the image of a woman gazing into a mirror a century ago, not so different from you. So close your eyes, let the past recede, and let sleep take you. Good night. Written by Clara Finch.